about that script again, isn't it?
Mm,
There's one expected life story,
mm.
and divergence from that can just blow people's minds for whatever uh, reason. So I think that's a really lovely way of encapsulating that.
Welcome to the Full Stop Podcast, a childless community podcast supported by an online community for all who identify as childless not by choice. The podcast is presented by Michael Hughes, Sarah Lawrence and me, Berenice Howard-Smith. The Full Stop Podcast delves into the many facets that make up the childless identity, as well as what's going on in the wider community. We hope that you will find your own narrative with our help and the words of our guests. We also aim to educate those who do not identify as childless so they can begin to understand and support those in their lives who may be facing a life as non-parents. We're really pleased to welcome Ali Hall from Childfree by Choice and Dr. Dawn Llewellyn, both of whom you may know from being on stage at Storyhouse Childless. We wanted to explore the spaces between child-free and childless, to understand what divides us and how we might be able to work together, and to ask some really gritty questions and get some really honest answers. Now, this is a groundbreaking episode for us, as all of our guests in the past 5 years have been childless for any reason. And we're grateful and thanks to Dawn and Ali for their compassion, wisdom and helping us to hold a safe space. We hope you enjoy this podcast. Hey, good morning, Dawn. Good morning, Ali.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having us.
Morning, really nice to be here. Thank you.
You've been on your travels as well, Dawn, because I've been looking at all of your pictures.
Yeah, we got back from a couple of weeks traveling around Vietnam. It feels like a long time ago now, but we've definitely got that sort of holiday hangover where you're still trying to create those, Vietnamese moments. So we had a barbecue last night, and I've bought 3 Vietnamese cookery books since we got back, and I'm trying to experiment with all of it. So yeah, we had a good time. And when I say me, I mean my partner Bran and I.
Lovely, fantastic. I love the photographs, and it's such a nice thing, isn't it, to bring in cooking, I think, as well as a holiday memory. It's quite nice to do that. And good morning, Ali. It's lovely to have you with us as well today. It's been a while since we've chatted on X. We sort of do tend to do that quite a bit. You've been following us for some time, and we've been having all sorts of wonderful conversations in the Twitter sphere. I still call it Twitter. I can't really call it X yet, but yeah.
Me too. And I think I know I've said this to your face at the wonderful Storyhouse Chester, but you've really, I think it's yourself and the Full Stop podcast that has really been a segue to opening my eyes to the childless and educating myself more. Because I think when I first started talking about being a non-parent, it was very much from the child-free perspective, and I didn't hold enough space for the childless. And I think it's down to yourself. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. That's really something. And I was just kind of, it's lovely to meet both of you at Storyhouse. And apologies to listeners that can't get to Storyhouse, but Dawn is instrumental in bringing that all together with Nicola as well. So just thank you for giving us the opportunity to meet Ali and each other, the three of us, because we all met too, which was a bit weird. So thank you very much for that, Dawn. I know that you're putting all the plans together for this year as well. That's all coming to fruition.
Yeah, and I think that vision that we had for Storyhouse Childless when we first started to think about what an event like that might look like, it was very much emphasizing how do we build community, how do we build bridges, how do we build connection across all of those complicated experiences that pronatalism makes even more difficult and more challenging for. So if you could have said to us, starting Storyhouse Childless, where would you like to be in sort of 4 or 5 years' time? I don't think we would have quite envisaged just how wonderful the space has grown and how involved people are. So yes, we're looking forward to the next one. 28th and 29th. And of course, you all are there. You are all there. And it would not be the same event without you.
Spoiler.
Uh,
Always. I think people know that already. I wanted just to bring something in here, Ali, and I hope you don't mind me sharing this because it reflects a bit on Dawn and what you've just said there, and perhaps a reason maybe for the context of this episode, because obviously this is a bit of a groundbreaking episode for us, because up until this point, everyone who has been a guest on the podcast has been childless, not by choice, for many, many reasons, all those complicated reasons. And of course, we welcomed you both here. You've chosen not to have children. And that can cause, it's caused some sort of like, oh, that's interesting and different. And are you sure? And people might have questioned the three of us and our status. And definitely we are childless, not by choice, for the different reasons that we've always talked about and kept consistently within our story, because that's part of our makeup. But one thing that I wanted to pull out, Ali, and it was your email to us that said, any conversations that we can hold that will help build unity, connection, and understanding between the child-free, the childless, and parents is a great thing as far as I'm concerned. And I thought that was very moving. There's another bit to that too, but that stood out the most and chimed with me as being a really good reason to have this conversation today in an environment where I hope it's going to be a safe space for everybody here, and our guests as well that are in here waiting to ask questions too. But I wanted just to reflect on perhaps a question to you both about, we were asked in our episode, our birthday episode, about what we felt had changed for the childless in the 5 years that we've been going. And I wanted to put that question back to you. Do you think things have changed in terms of child-free? I struggle with the word child-free because I'm so used to saying childless. But for child-free people, has it changed for you over the past 5 years, for both of you, in any way, do you feel, attitudes?
Go on, Ali.
Shall I go first, Dawn?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Has it changed? I have seen huge changes, and not all for the better, I'm going to say. Okay, I'm going to be as succinct as I can. I think I actually started speaking about this and being open about it and writing about it. When I say it, I mean child free, and that's transitioned to kind of non-parents in a way. And I think at that time, roughly 5 years ago, that I didn't see that many social media accounts. I didn't see that many, let's say, influencers, because I think now what I'm seeing from a child-free position, and I've got very mixed feelings about this, which might come out in the podcast, is there's a lot of influencers who are going out there celebrating being child-free, and that is, you know what, fair play to them, because they are pushing back on a bit of oppression, perhaps, from over the years. But I can't help but feel there's sometimes insensitivity there for childless. So it's maybe increasing this chasm. And it's just creating this, I think it's creating a bigger divide. And there's us out here trying to kind of be empathetic and sympathetic and reduce the chasm and recognize we all experience happiness and joy and suffering in different ways. And I'm just seeing all these accounts that are just tone deaf, if for want of a better expression. And I'm struggling with that, if I'm honest. But I feel I'm trying to get this message out. And then along comes saying, I don't know, that people without children don't necessarily have more time or don't necessarily have more money, or, and then you get this influencer with 50,000 followers saying, look at all the money I've got. And it just is like, you're creating this divide. So I think we're more prevalent in being seen. I'm seeing articles in decent newspapers and magazines. But I feel it's being classed as a movement, as opposed to an inner calling. And I think it's getting a lot of pushback, and I think it's creating divides. So that's my observations.
I think I think I'd agree with a lot of what Ali said. When I first started sort of thinking and researching this stuff about 12 years ago now, it was really difficult to find examples in the public sphere of childlessness, just generally speaking, actually. So I think the visibility and the literacy around it has grown and developed. And that's partly because of the work that all of us have been doing for all of this time. Jodie's work, Full Stop podcast, all of that sort of stuff helps to just punctuate places and make room for these conversations. I think Ali's right. There's still a real binary. I sort of I've sort of really noted that division sometimes when people are creating childless spaces, whether that be particularly child free or childlessness by choice. I'm not mad on child free. I sometimes flip between using child free about myself, not using it about myself. Sometimes I just say, not a parent, don't have children. So I think the language is becoming more sensitive too. That sort of reflects that. But you're right, Ali, that it can feel a bit insensitive and a bit sort of anti-parenting, almost a bit sort of anti-natalist, some of that language and some of the way in which some of those influencers and public figures, shall we say, sort of name it. But I think we sort of notice it more, isn't it? When you're sort of in that world, you start to notice people. So, I remember when Sarah Millican first sort of said, well, started making her stand-up about not having children and other comedians. And I really welcomed that, because that was, again, a different way of telling the story that didn't set up necessarily some of those binaries. So I think visibility is increasing at some level, right? It's not there in social policy. It's not necessarily there in HR policy. And as some of you know, I work in religious studies. I'm an academic who works in religious studies. It's not there in lots of religious contexts. Right. So there's where pronatalism sort of happens as a structure, it can cause these we know it causes all sorts of oppressions, but it can be quite heavy in some places and a bit lighter in others. So I would sort of say it depends on the context, and yeah, I'm a bit mindful, as Ali is, of these harsh binaries between parents and non-parents, as well as childless and child free. We need to smash those binaries up a little bit and raise that awareness when people are clumsy about their language, and just sort of say, actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. And there's probably a lot more holding us together than there is separating us.
I think it's really difficult, isn't it? What I'm finding is, as you rightly say, there's an awful lot more visibility for child free. I don't like the labels either, but I think we're kind of stuck with them for the time being, aren't we? Until we develop a language around it. But I kind of feel that almost like the child free come in for quite a lot of stick around being selfish, anti-children, anti-parents, but we all kind of get lumped in together if there's not that sort of quite that visibility around the childless. It's almost like we're kind of hidden behind the child free, and we're all sort of tarred with the same brush. I kind of find that I find that really difficult, because obviously working with people that have been unable to have children, we do avoid children, but not because we dislike them, but because we find it painful. And we haven't quite got that visibility yet, and that language around that even.
Which is bizarre when you think about how the statistics are in terms of who is the sort of if you're taking all of childlessness, as an experience, and who may comprise most of that group, it tends to be childless by circumstance rather than childless by choice. So I think that skewed look, Sarah, is really helpful. I think there's also a tendency to lump all of it together, actually, no matter where it's coming from. That, like I was sort of saying before, it's that lack of nuance that we're seeing when the message is out there or the discourse is out there. There is generally a lack of nuance, and certainly written again in sort of going back to sort of some contexts like religion. There's more of a taboo about being childless by choice than there is around being childless by circumstance or childlessness not by choice. But I often sort of say that we have to sort of work on the sympathy and empathy in order to challenge it when that does happen, Sarah. I think to call that out.
I'm going to add to that. And I think, and actually, I shared, you put out a tweet from Full Stop Podcast about this recording. And one of the comments, and this is the basis of my kind of input here, is from someone, I forget their Twitter handle, so excuse me if you're listening to this, but thank you for your comment. But saying, that they're childless and they really appreciate conversation and allyship from Childfree. And I think, and what she kind of went on to suggest, and what I'm going to paraphrase here is, I think a lot of the time when Childfree are vocal, but in a holistic way, I think we can carry the childless when they're hurting and grieving and feel like they've lost their voice. And I feel sometimes the childless are pushed more into an invisible hole because the pushback on those with non-parents are really attacking the child free, and they're kind of silent on the childless. But can that can have a really deep impact on the childless. So while, oh, sorry, I'm assuming here, because whilst there might be those comments from the Pope or comments from Elon Musk or comments from all, the accusatory to the child free, but somewhere in this silent ether is the kind of the childless thinking, well, I'm not even considered here. And I can only begin to imagine, if you're suffering and feeling vulnerable and hurting and grieving, that you might lose your voice a little bit. So I really try my best, and I think I'm getting better over time, is to try and not speak for the people who are childless, but recognize that I have the confidence to have a voice in this when some people might not yet.
One of my very close friends, who has been on this sort of journey with me, is childless, not by choice, and very painfully so. And I remember those early conversations with her when I was starting to think about this being not having children for myself, and sort of thinking about my work in this area. And the conversations with her really, she always said, I didn't think I would sort of find allyship or friendship about my reproductive journey, my infertility, my childlessness, with someone who had sort of chosen not to. So I might get a bit choked up here. She's a very dear friend, and she just sort of said, but it's all grist to the mill, right? Every time you say something or talk about something, or you lecture it, or you lecture on it, or every time somebody makes a pronatalist assumption and one of us steps in, that's grist to the mill. That's allyship, and that's solidarity. And I think solidarity is such an important word in some of this. But I think one of the things that conversation and shared stories and narratives sort of help us do is heighten that what am I saying? That sympathy, or that empathy, that understanding. And that's why I think the stuff that Ali does. And Ali, you don't underestimate you do it beautifully. Ali, you give that space really beautifully, and you hold that space really beautifully. So yeah, that was that. So it's that sort of grist to the mill. Like, we've got to keep calling it out. And sometimes I don't feel like calling it out, Ali. I don't know about you. Sometimes I'm just exhausted about calling out every pronatalist assumption that I hear in the workplace and social situations. I was chatting to someone yesterday who knows exactly what I do, and she just sort of went, so are your kids here, like at home? And I was just like, no, they're not. And it's that's tiring, isn't it, for everybody in that position, that our justification or assumptions about us we still have to sort of push back on that every time. Michael, I interrupted you.
I didn't get started, so it's okay. It's no secret between the three of us that I wasn't looking forward to this episode. And it's not because of you two lovely ladies, don't get me wrong. I've had a lot of experiences, and I know people who have shared their experiences with me where, Ali, what you talked about, how the childless tend to, I'll use my words, get silenced. Just recently, there is a group in Australia that is it's a group set up for both child-free women. And some of the feedback that I get from that is that the child. Sorry, I'm Gen X, so I do binary really well. Right, so just put that in there. Where was I? Child free tend to be more vocal because they are sure about their choice, and rightly so. But unfortunately, what that does is that drowns out, like you were saying, Ali, it drowns out those who are childless. A good friend of ours, Sarah Roberts, I really love the way that she says that being childless and child-free are two very different ways of existing in the world. Sorry, I'm binary again. But I must say that you two are great examples of how, allyship and empathy can be seen, between the groups. But yeah, so getting back to what I was saying is I was feeling quite uncomfortable about this episode because I'm not quite sure where I sit with all this, to be quite honest. And this is nothing against you two. It's just that I hear so many stories about how childless get shut down in these environments. And I know where it comes from, of course, because one of the things I've done where I work is I've talked very openly about my childlessness. And I've had people say to me, oh, I didn't even know that was a thing. So, if you don't have kids, well, you've chosen not to have kids. And that's the end of it for most people. And so, yeah, I'm interested to hear your views on that. Childless and child-free are two very different ways of existing in the world.
Wow, thank you so much, Michael, for your honesty there as well, because I understand this is something I'm astutely aware of, that I think for some childless people and possibly people in your audience here are kind of looking at Dawn and I and thinking a bit of resentment. You had the choice and something that you yourselves wanted so deeply, and here we are just throwing it away. Now the truth, I might not be able to. Okay, Dawn might not be able to, but we've chosen not to. We've opted out of something that means so much to yourselves. I've got goosebumps even saying that because I recognize that. And I think that's really hard to untangle because that's one of the biggest divides. And it can seem insulting and offensive to yourselves. I get that as well. And Michael, once you were speaking then, you're saying, I can't help but think it's almost like the child free are the extroverts and the childless are the introverts. Like in terms of, yeah, I don't, again, we're putting binaries, we're putting labels on it. I completely agree. I think we are living completely different existences. I always talk about flavors of life. And once all groups, because in a way we're being binary by saying childless and child free. I also know a lot of people who it's a really grey area for them. They're really maybe ambivalent or it, yeah, I mean, I'm very certain. And I made a few notes, well, a few words down. I feel that when I was most vocal and listened less, I feel it was because I was defensive. And I felt I was being attacked and criticized and dehumanized for choosing not to have children. So I was particularly defensive and I didn't listen. But I think as I've listened more and held more space and heard the individual stories, I hope that has, how do I say it? I hope that's like I can't ever pretend to know what it's like to be childless. But I can admit that I can't say, oh, I know what it's like, or that must, I can't compare it to anything. And I think that's all I can do. And if I can encourage other people in the child-free spheres to do the same. And I also want to highlight, actually, I think you yourself might probably have it and I was about to say harder, but that's what we're trying not to do, like compare, right? But I think being a man in a childless sphere, I know you've done a really good job of creating kind of men shitty vibes, but there's still inadequate recognition for men and that men suffer and that men grieve and that men hurt around not being able to have children. And that in itself can be really isolating and lonely. So where I kind of see it, and I'll let them shut up. I keep wanted on. I see it as kind of child free here, childless here. We've got these different paths that we've come in a completely different trajectory through our lives. But I do feel at one point we can come together a little bit, not together, but you've got the different paths, and we can then, I guess that's where pronatalism is coming in. So our paths converge somewhere because of societal attitude. Sarah's got a hand up, and it's time for me to shut up. To you.
I'm sorry, Ali. I didn't mean to shut you down there. I was just waiting. I was going to sort of say, actually, I think with we're back with the binary, but back with the childless, child free. I know from my own experience, when I first came to be childless, I had an awful lot of I was very angry actually, and I blundered into what I thought was a childless support group, but was child free. And actual fact, I think I recognise what you're saying when I wasn't in a place to listen or sit with people that had made the choice. And I think I think you have to be in a good place with where you're at in order to be able to start to open up to the possibilities that we are kind of sitting in a very similar space. And I think that's possibly the difference, that we're sitting with this uncomfortable truth that, some of us get to make that choice and some of us sadly didn't. And I think that's the bit that probably is kind of almost like the elephant in the room, isn't it? Is that we don't get to understand your viewpoint that you made a choice when actually, some of us may have been sitting in ambivalence, but ultimately we've come down on, I wanted them, I couldn't have them. And I think that's the tricky bit we need to navigate in essence, is kind of child-free people. Some people, they're never going to understand the fact that we're childless. But it's meeting the people in the middle that are able to perhaps sit with that elephant in the room and go, well, yeah, that is shit. That is shit. You didn't get what you want. But we can come together over the similarities. But I know at the beginning, when I was deep in my grief, there was no way I could sit in this conversation comfortably and go, I'm all right with this. So I know some of our listeners are going to be like, what are you doing?
And there'll be some who won't want to tune in. I was sort of acutely aware of that today. That it won't be the right conversation. I think, I know we keep using pronatalism in a sort of structural way, but it does create a way of helping us at least sort of intellectualize it. It doesn't do anything for hurt and pain necessarily. It might help sort of explain things a little bit, but that's the sort of as far as that sort of language goes. I think one of the things though it does do is it disguises the because it offers childlessness. Pronatalism sort of tells this story about childlessness as being either one of choice or one of not choice. And for people who are childless by choice, as Ali says, it's not always a straightforward decision. It's not a one-off choice. It's not a one-off decision. It can have painful moments in its own way, in all sorts of ways. And Ali's talked about previously, quite publicly, about some of the painful ways it shaped her life. For some of the women in my research, although they sort of say they're childless by choice or voluntarily childless, actually that's been a journey that's been that's where they've said, well, I'm childless not by choice, or I'm childless by circumstance. And actually what's happened is that my understanding of that has sort of come on. For those, I know we're on video, we're not on video, are we? But I'm making sort of hand gestures, everyone, to sort of point to how in some of the women's experiences that I've talked about, they're retrospectively sort of saying, well, this has been so painful for me. It's the grief and bereavement are never going to leave, but it helps me to think about my life as being, childless by choice, because then I can sort of own it. And that's another way in which this binary is way more smudgy than it might present in some of the ways that we've suggested. And I would never collapse the experiences either, because one of the joys of solidarity and friendship and shared conversation is that you notice the differences and you share those differences. And so it's really important not to collapse, anybody's grief with anybody else's grief. We don't experience those things in the same way. And they'll feel different. Those decisions will feel different, and they'll feel different at different points in our lives, won't we? And I think that space that I've sort of mentioned how beautifully Ali holds that space. I think she does, that takes learning too. I sort of, when I was talking about my friend who's been on this journey with me together, having that, it's quite precious to have the sort of friendship and conversation where you can hold the weight of those tensions and those differences. And I'm sounding a bit utopian, like, oh, all we need to do is like have lovely chats and it'll all like sort it all out. It's not. It's challenging, and it's and it's difficult. And I want to be called out if I collapse it too easily. And I want to sort of be called to account if I slip into that lack of understanding that I spend most of my time, pulling out in others. And I think, sorry, the dog, not even our dog, it's Nicola's dog. and I think, where was I? So yeah, that I'm always really try and be really wary about that collapse, because it's not helpful to anyone. Does that answer? Sorry, it was sort of referring back to Michael's and sort of Sarah's and Ali's conversation there.
No, I think that was really good. I actually found, this is kind of to put it up against what I found online, but a lot of my friends are child free. And actually, when I first found out I was going to be childless, they were the safest place, as opposed to my parented friends. And it wasn't even that they necessarily understood, but we weren't having those tricky conversations. We could join together over the, we don't have to talk about this. And actual fact, I owe them a lot, actually, because they were sort of like, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about everything but that. And it was really helpful. So no, I think it's not necessarily even collapsing it together, is it? It's just accepting that we have a shared experience, albeit we've come at it from different places and different ways.
And I don't know about Ali, but I try never to take for granted that I've got a choice, because there's been an awful lot of, political wrangling, an awful lot of campaigning. I'm a feminist, everyone. Feminism has sort of helped. This choice has not come easy, and it's an entitled choice, and it's not a choice that everybody has. Not everybody is in control of how they think about their reproductive identities, and so I'm aware of that too, sitting in the Western world as a sort of white middle class academic, that I have that choice. So there's that aspect of having choice too, as well as the aspect of choice that people are grieving that they didn't get a chance to make. And Sarah, that's really interesting what you said about your friendships with non-parents being a really safe space. After Storyhouse Childless, 3 of the men who have been coming to Storyhouse Childless, one's one's child free or childless by choice, or just like a human. That's Bran. I'll give the game away. It's Bran has hooked up with 2 of the other boys. They go, who are childless not by choice, and they go for beers, and they just sort of meet sort of every sort of like I don't know, every once a couple of months, and it's because it's a safe space, because those conversations just aren't assumed, and it's not littered with conversations about children. There are other aspects of our lives to share and talk about, and so that's come quite late on actually for them in terms of their story and their journey. But that's another moment of friendship and solidarity, I think.
I think, coming in on that, Dawn, I think actually going further from Sarah saying you felt that solidarity with your child-free friends, that's something I've noticed that when I join some form of women's space, default to a mum's space. So I think when we're amongst other people who don't have children for whatever reason, we there's a safety there in that we know the conversation isn't going to be dominated by what little Johnny's been up to or comparing parental notes or things like that. And that can feel quite liberating sometimes. And sometimes you don't even notice it. But I think we all sure as hell notice when we're in a space that is just talking about their kids or just, sharing notes. We really notice that. And I think that's something that we all came away, well, I certainly came away from Storyhouse Childless recognizing, God, we talked about hopes, dreams, fears, life, plans. And it wasn't just centered around what school's your kid going to next year. And don't get me wrong, that those conversations, of course, they have to happen, and that's the center of parents' world. But sometimes when you're in the periphery of those conversations time and time again, it can feel really alienating. But what I wanted to quickly say is Dawn said that choosing not to have children is a privilege, and I want to absolutely back that up and recognize that. I don't know if any of you heard the conversation going on. Now, it was a couple of months ago, and this was picked up by various news stations because it said there was this claim by a DEI teacher saying that people without children were privileged. But it didn't distinguish between by choice or childless. And I went on LBC and spoke with Sangeeta Miskar about this. And she is an amazing ally for the childless. She speaks very emotionally about how she wants to have children and she couldn't, and she can sometimes, if it's a relevant topic, she will bring in her own experience. And so I kind of made it very clear that not having children when you want children is not privilege. And it was just so damaging putting that out and so invalidating. And I made it very clear that for me, I recognize my privilege in the country I live in, the government system I've got in place, all of that. For me, choosing not to is a privilege, but not having children is not a privilege. And I'll pass over to Michael.
I want to take a step back a bit to what Dawn was saying about being utopian. I agree that there is an endpoint that we should be at a place where we can collaborate. But unfortunately, and this is where I guess my uncomfortableness sits. Is that such a word? Anyway, I've just invented it, so it doesn't matter. Is that right now the world, let's say, or generalise, the world sees people that don't have children, people who, as we've discussed, chose not to, which is a right that everyone has. But unfortunately, when I just want to build on when I was talking about how we get drowned out, is that I think my role now from now on is to make sure that, or somehow add to the fact that we as childless need to develop the narrative to say this is what childlessness is. So that, yes, we have parallel paths and there will be crossovers, but I think it's very important that we as a community actually step up and go, this is what childlessness is. Because until we can do that, we will never be seen. And so, I think that's where my uncomfortableness sits, where it's not that I don't want to be friends or I don't want to collaborate, but I think right now it's too early because we need to say this is what childlessness is. So if you look at all the minority, well, actually we're not a minority group really, but you look at all those groups that have grabbed hold of the word that was once derogatory and gone, no, we're having that back and this is what it means. So, sorry I derailed the conversation there, but that's
nodding. Just nodding the whole way through.
So that's where my binary sits, and that's what is the foundation for that.
You're absolutely right. Whenever there is an experience or identity or a community or narrative or story that still, marginalized is a really useful term if communities and groups own that, and that's their experience. But I think in this context we can use it right when marginalized groups and voices and narratives are so still silenced by a dominant story that makes those stories taboo or secret or silenced or shameful or cover them, shroud them in guilt, then absolutely that reclamation of an experience and that naming of an experience is a really, it's not just a strategy. You see political groups have used that, feminism use that, right? But it's not I don't want to say it's just a political strategy, but you have to say what's distinctive. You have to sort of say what's core or commonalities within and across that sort of space for and individuality and difference within a collective voice. You absolutely have to do that, because otherwise it continues to get drowned out. Michael, you're absolutely right, which goes back to that point I was making about not collapsing too quickly and not collapsing too early. And that's why I'm hesitant around saying it sounds like all really utopian and neat and why can't we all just get along. That's not what I mean, actually. It's those crunchy points that are really important, and not speaking, one who interrupts a lot, not over not over speaking and talking over someone. Again, I'm not very good either on screen at working out when people want to speak very well, but yeah, that is really important, and I don't know. I don't think when we talk like this, it sounds like there's going to be a tipping point, right? Well, our stories are claimed, our stories are now known. We're not living in a world where some voices are marginalized and others aren't. So we don't have to claim that. I don't think there's ever a tipping point if it's not the dominant story. If it's silenced and squished by that heavy, horrible word pronatalism again, which is it, then it's never gonna. I don't think we're ever going to see a world where pronatalism has gone.
No.
That I think that tipping point, I don't think it ever comes, which is why it is really important to keep naming the distinctiveness. But that doesn't mean you can't find points, I think, for me.
I was going to piggyback off that, and we've just had a comment in the comments sort of saying, I feel that anything we can do to make that voice louder and clearer has got to be a good thing. And I can't help thinking about the LGBTQI+ community. So there you've got lots of different threads of people that don't identify as heteronormative, but they come together as a community and their voice is bigger. And I know we're sort of saying, well, there are differences between Childfree and Childless, but I think as time has gone on and I've dealt with my own feelings, I can't help feeling that actually coming together as the two communities, we're non-parented. I can't help feeling that actually at some point the childless will find more of a voice along with the Childfree. And actually I think there's power in us sort of working together and having that allyship, much the same as the LGBTQ+ community, because if they were to go at it individually they wouldn't have that much authority or such a clear and resonant voice as a community. So I kind of sit, I think, a little bit differently with it.
Oh, sorry, me again. I was just going to just piggyback a bit of that, and I got quite lost in the conversation because there was so much talking around the subject, and I've lost my thread completely because it went off. Where am I going with this? Where I was going with this was actually kind of back to the article that you wrote a while ago, and that interview that you gave Ali on LBC, because it came from the back. I think of something about the article you attacked was quite vocal about on the should we tax the childless on Medium, because that came up, and there was I know I wrote about that, and it was an article that was written in the Times, must have been about a year, maybe 2 years ago, about childless should be taxed. And then there was another article about a year later about child-free travellers should be banned from going on a holiday. And one of the things you'd mentioned in your reply on Medium was that the headings are clickbait, and the substance of both articles is worrying and dangerous, and it's pronatalism at its best. So people look at the titles in these newspapers and then instantly make a kind of a judgment, and they're written in such a way. And what I loved about that was that I'd written something that was kind of just like, you'd written something that was also, but in a slightly different way. Obviously, you came from it in a different point of view. But what it felt like was that actually there was an alliance in kind of that fight back against pronatalism, because I think the media don't know what to do with this. As we get more powerful together, and again, in that article in Medium, you were very clear. This is what child-free is. This is what childless is. You define that so well in the article, and I will put it in the show notes so people can have a look at it. It's on Medium, but it was just really, really good about these terms and how journalism and media can substitute these terms. And I think it happens as well in different kind of in different platforms on TV and on radio and things like that too. It's very easily interchangeable. And I'm just wondering whether, and based on something that actually happened to me in my own life, was that parts of my family thought I was child free until I actually started to talk about it and say, actually, no, there's a whole thing going on here. And then it got more uncomfortable because it was more comfortable for them to assume that I had chosen not to have children than to actually understand that I hadn't, and I had to make some difficult stuff had gone on in my life. And I'm wondering whether it's more that as child free, and again, I feel very uncomfortable about these terms because I know that certainly with my friends who are identify as LGBTQIA plus are torn because they don't have some choices, or they just don't, it's complicated. But I'm just wondering whether sometimes as child-free people, you are more attacked or more targeted perhaps than us, because the grief of childless is so complex to other people that they'd rather not sit with that. There's a discomfort there. And I wonder if sometimes you perhaps feel more vulnerability in some ways than perhaps we do, because at least I can turn around and go, actually, I have this grief and here it is. And this is what it is.
I think that's a really interesting quandary. I feel, and this is, I can only speak for myself, and I need to caveat everything I say. I don't represent full child-free community. My experiences are my own experiences, my own opinions, my own thought. And I feel historically I've been looked at as a bit monstrous for choosing not to. I must be cold and callous and calculated, and I must hate children. I must be egocentric. There's all these assumptions about me, and that there's parts of me, I've been at weddings where someone's kind of turned around who I'm sat next to, and they start asking me about children, and as soon as they find out I don't have children, and I make it clear that I've chosen not to, because I want to open up the dialogue, and because from past experience, if I have just said I don't have, I often get quite pitying responses, like, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and fair enough for them giving that compassion if it wasn't a choice. But there's the assumption I've experienced. It's interesting because I think Michael said something that the assumption with people who don't have children that it's a choice. I've experienced a lot of people assuming that I don't have children and it's not a choice, and they felt sorry for me. And I think there's a difference between pity and sympathy and empathy, and I hope people meet those who are childless with empathy and sympathy. But I know, I think your experience is going to be different. I feel I'm perceived as quite monstrous and less than, which is probably something yourselves experience as well. And kind of inadequate. And what's the point in me? If I've, it's kind of like, well, you've not even tried. So what's the point in your life? What's the point in you? So, all the time, can I add? But that's how it sometimes lands and some of my experiences.
Yeah, it's similar. One of my friends who just took a very long time to get pregnant, her mum couldn't sort of understand that she'd been married such a long time, didn't have children, so she wrote that story for her and started to tell all her friends that she was childless, not by choice. So and I think I've experienced that too, where it's assumed that I can't, So I again, the pity, it comes through. I do make it clear to people that it's by choice, because I don't want to do that collapse. I want people to understand that there are lots of different ways in which childlessness happens, and this happens to be the space in which I sit. I've also had the sort of, oh, that's a shame, people like you should have children, which is like awkward, and you're sort of like, I don't really know what to do with that. There's lots of things I might be good at that I haven't tried, or lots of things I might contribute that I haven't tried. Doesn't mean that I should do it. The selfishness, the assumptions that I'm career orientated and career driven, and that all I want to do is go on holiday to Vietnam and look after somebody else's dog. That's definitely responses that I've had. But the one that I find the most difficult is, though, that's a real shame. It's a real shame, and I think that's probably, that's the one I find most difficult to deal with. I sort of want to tell them to F off, but I'm sometimes a bit more polite. But I think that, that's the sort of responses that I've had that I can bring to mind.
Do you think, out of curiosity, because I hate the pitying look, do you think it's because we're women?
Yeah, a bit.
Get it?
Yeah, I think it is gendered. I definitely get asked. I think we've all talked about this at Storyhouse Childless a little bit. That Bran, my partner, rarely gets asked why. I'm quizzed. Well, why not? What's that about? How come? It's happening less as I'm older too, so it's about my age too, right? Like in my 20s and 30s, and early 40s, it was definitely well, why not? How come? And we've that endless justification for the choice. That's something, and I don't mind doing that. The same reason Ali sort of said, because I want to start. I'm happy to have the. Well, no, sometimes I'm happy to have the conversation, and sometimes I'm really not. It does depend on the context. So having to justify why, in the same way that, again, this is quite a common story, in the same way that people who choose to have children are never asked to justify that particular choice. I've also had sort of things where, again, people assume that I don't like children, so physically sort of moving children away from me. I've had that before in social situations, like, oh well, you probably don't like, let's, and it's not done in a kind, thoughtful way, shall we say. And it's almost automatic. The person doing it isn't really realizing that they're standing between me and their child that I was previously talking to. or the assumption that I don't like children. And I sometimes just say to that, well, I wouldn't eat a whole one, as again a way to just try and disrupt that a little bit. Ali, I think you and I have talked about this before, but when people ask me if I've got children, depending on how cheeky and naughty I'm feeling, I sometimes say, not that I know of. And I've stolen that from a gay friend of mine, like a male gay friend of mine. But Sarah, it is gendered. We've talked about scripts. Michael sort of saying there's if you have a marginalized story, then there isn't always a script for you. And I think that scriptlessness is there across lots of experiences of childlessness. But I think for women, that expectation is written onto our bodies in very essentialized ways. Pronatalism creates an essentialized sense of what women are supposed to be, what men are supposed to be, which is again, and that essentialism does feed back into our LGBTQIA communities, because again, there's no script. That's sort of like another script that's non-normative, that doesn't exist, right? So you've got a script of the pronatalist happy family, you've got that other script of gendered variance, or different sexualities, or different gendered identities. So yeah, it is absolutely gendered. Pronatalism is a gendered narrative. That's not to say that women's experiences are trump. It's not a sort of like, whenever we talk about this, it's not a sort of like, well, my experiences are more difficult because I'm this and I'm that and I'm that. It's not about that. It's about the way the structures and the structures right into this. So yes, gender is definitely one of those structures. Heteronormativity is one of those structures. Race is one of those structures.
I think talking about scripts there, Dawn, it made me think I wrote an article recently about, I think it was titled something like Bridging the Gap Between the Parents, the Child-Free and the Childless. And I recognized something that kind of made me think. I was listening to a podcast, or I was maybe scrolling through Instagram or something, and I don't know, I can't for the life of me remember who it was, but it was a mummy influencer who said, when you have children, you aren't represented in the media. And my mind was blown. I was like, for me, I got kind of defensive listening to this, and I was like, so when she was saying the media, she meant films and books, and I was thinking, but and when I say we, non-parents don't feel represented. So how can mums so feel not represented? Who's media then? But I thought, and I was like, oh, what, you're actually right. So so I feel non-parents aren't. We all know films, box sets, books. There is very rarely a lead character who is vocally child-free or childless. And the end of the story is they had a baby and all lived happily ever after. So the ending is always the miracle baby that, so it's so heteronormative. But what I then realized, so whilst I was trying to find similarities and validate the parental experience as well, it could be a bit of a debate, but trying my best to see where this influence is coming from. The script in these things is that the adventure, the story, the thrust of the book or the film isn't the parenting. The adventure happens, life happens. And then after the adventure, after the excitement and the thing that's worthy of the story, it's when children come along. So I kind of then, oh my God, we're all suffering. We're all feeling invisible. We're all not being validated. And the ending is kind of then twisted to suit oh, your life has happened, now you have children, but off you go and slink away because now's not the story. And I that really made me think and try to kind of see it from all angles. But of course, I had to kind of talk about Annie Kirby's book, how she kind of had the child-free and childless characters. So of course, I had to give all the kind of credit to and inject that in and just recognize how we as a non-parent community feel about lack of representation in media. But I can't help but feel that parent wasn't wrong. And I just thought that was an interesting perspective. Sorry.
That's an interesting one because actually we've been speaking to, Sarah and I have both been working with someone called Rachel Tillotson from the University of Gloucester on single voice engine or VERP, and she's collecting how people feel, mothers, child-free, childless women. It's actually ongoing at the time of recording this and writing now. That research is open as well, and we'll put it in the show notes because it's been just interesting. I've been working on the website side of it, but Sarah, I know you've had more in-depth conversations about that on the research as well. And just that point where I thought, why asking mothers? But actually, it's kind of women, really. And it links to something else that I was reading on. Oh, I'm trying to remember what it was on. It was on Samantha Jane Walsh's Not Mum network thing, and it was a post about. And it was whatever it was that was sourced, and I'm being really crap at remembering what it was, but it was about, again, dividing women. So child-free, childless, mothers. And someone put on there as a reply, what about just women? Why are we creating these divides where it's them, us, and you over there? And what about all of us together? And it's one of those things where I started doing it on our social media, is actually tagging family in some of our hashtags, because I think it is, we could argue that our podcast is a family. The listeners, the people that are here with us today, and our online community, that also is a family. It's just it's a different way of looking at something. Me and my dog were a family. You don't have to have that kind of. It's just turning and upending stuff and going, actually, hang on a minute, pronatalism is wrong because it hasn't moved with the times. It
So
hasn't.
it's always been wrong.
It's always been wrong, yeah. It's always been completely inherently wrong, isn't it? Antinatalism is a good one as well, but it's the labeling and the words and it's just so stuck in some archaic language. I'm conscious today that we're recording this on what is International Mother's Day, and how archaic and just antiquated and exclusionary such a thing is. You think, well, God, it's just we learn from history. We've learned so much from history that's wrong, and you're like, come on, let's just learn about this too and just change some shit, because it's just getting annoying now, I think. And just returning back to what you were saying, Ali, about your vulnerability and that, and I've seen that on social media with you, that people can be absolutely brutal, sometimes in a way that they're not, certainly not with the full stop. There's always something that we can evidence, but they're not in the same way. But I've seen it very much with you, and I think you're exceptionally brave to fight the fight you do. Very, very brave to do that. Don't underestimate what you're doing. It's quite incredible.
I pick and choose my battles. And can I also say, if there's been a nasty comment that I entertain, and when I say entertain, I reply to, it actually affects me. Like and then I kind of wonder, why am I doing this? This is just a random person on the internet. Like, why why kind of thing? And because I think sometimes some of my followers on Twitter will tag me in an argument that's going on, and I'm like, I don't want to know. Just having a nice day. I don't want to know. So sometimes I pick and choose. So thank you for your kind of, I am trying to involve myself in less antagonistic stuff, shall we
I think
say?
that's a good thing, yeah. Because it can linger, can't it? I don't know about you, but
Yeah.
sometimes I know when I was at the angry bit, and I think when we first started the podcast, when we didn't have quite enough stuff to kind of leverage. I think that's the great thing about when you have more stuff, like your Medium blog, and you've got more evidence to actually, these other people agree with me. But at that point, I used to get quite angry about that, and they'd be like, "No, hang on a minute," and then I go to bed, and then I wake up at 2 a.m. going, "That random shit on Twitter," and I'm like, I don't know who they are. They're probably fast asleep. They don't give a toss about me. But actually, there's a kind of, as you start to kind of like maybe find alliances, perhaps, then you can sort of settle in and go, actually, yeah, you're wrong, but I don't maybe need to tell you that. You're just on a losing streak here, or just beg to differ. Sometimes life can be too short, can't it? And energy is best used elsewhere.
I think you're right that picking your battles is really crucial, but that's about boundaries, isn't it? And sort of looking after ourselves and each other. Can I just go back to what you were saying, Berenice, about that collapsing around women? And it happens around men too. That that the sort of essentializing of gendered roles. But controversially, when I first started doing my research on how women understand sort of reproductive choice in religious context, because I interviewed mothers and women who were childless or ambiguous or uncertain or unsure, or sometimes their identities had they'd experienced childlessness not by choice and by circumstances, and then sort of come to a childless by choice identity. That is it's still seen a little bit as not maybe a bit controversial, because again it's that collapsing of two very different identities, and I sort of always sort of say, well, I'm not collapsing. What I'm trying to say is that this binary again is a sort of false binary that's put up by essentialist discourses like pronatalism, and no more so than in religious contexts. And I'm not religious, but I am fascinated by how religious stories and narratives shape our world. But if we understanding pronatalism and therefore being able to challenge it is about understanding how it essentializes, men and women into these very fixed reproductive selves, and those accompanying characteristics that go along with it, that are also really, really harmful. So you'll have to send me this research that's the link to the research that's coming out of Gloucester. That sounds really, really fascinating. But I often start sort of every paper or every academic conference that I do or whatever with a sort of caveat about the terminology. Well, you can, this terminology is in use, this terminology is a bit problematic, participants sometimes identifies this and that, and when I'm at Storyhouse there's all these sorts of terms, and I often just start going, but why can't we just be people? Let's just call it that. So that was just a follow on from that point.
Thank you. I will send that to you, Rachel, stuff as well. Yeah. And I think it does apply to men. I'm just going to circling back to that comment because my husband met me a bit later on. And so he was unmarried. And it was kind of like, oh, yeah, that's fine. That was okay. It never came up as a thing as to why he hadn't met someone and had children. It just wasn't. Never. Until he met me. And then it became a thing. Occasionally, but only very, very rarely was it a thing. I was the one that was always questioned. And
Michael, do you find that?
I don't know whether it's because my husband wasn't married and we weren't living together, and I'd wonder whether it was something around that. I don't know whether the perception of having kind of the chattels of marriage made it different socially. Again, it's really hard to kind of understand it from the other side, isn't it? I can't put myself into the position of ever being someone who would never ask anybody else if they had kids or not. I can't, that question, because I've been asked it so often in so many, obviously in a judgmental way, or it's in a leading question, even if it's a question that you're asked because it binds you to somebody. I can't even imagine asking it ever. The words would not come out ever. They just can't. They don't flow in any way or form. But I just wonder whether it's that also that difference between whether a man or a woman, whether you're attached. Does that again make it acceptable in pronatalism to ask that? Is that the kind of narrative? And if so, that is just really wrong. But I don't know. Michael, sorry, I'm digressing. Save me.
You saved me because my mouse has shit itself, so I've had to go to my trackpad.
Oh no.
I think as a man, I'll generalise again. When you're talking about not being able to have kids, generally people just go to one place. There's something wrong with you. And so then the conversation stops because then everyone starts feeling uncomfortable and not going there. When, Ali, you were talking about the parents and not represented in media, I always use the Game of Thrones analogy in this sort of situation, where one of the most successful TV shows ever, and I know Berenice hadn't seen it, if you look at every flawed man in that show, none of them have children. But if you look at every man that is powerful, is seen as a leader, has a whole tribe of children. And I think that is symbolic of the way that men are treated in this situation. But it's just a straight go to, there's something wrong with you. Because, as we know, every man can have a kid, apparently, until he's 80. Obviously, we know that's not true. But, yeah.
I think you raised such an incredible point. It's such a different experience for men, and you bring so much to this, Michael. Because I'm vocal about this, but I don't talk about it an awful lot. It's my husband could have gone either way. I think he just assumed that I would want children, and we had many conversations, there's been many tears. He would still, although again he doesn't attach himself onto labels, but he would see himself as childless, and there would be a bit of grief in there. But it's so fascinating that now that you've said that about the Game of Thrones, is that I feel men are viewed as successful, it's about legacy. And I'm I'm wondering as well, is there a kind of emasculating kind of cape, silencing cape that men who can't have children are kind of smothered in? It's really invisibly.
Absolutely. If with the childless, okay, we're going binary here, but the childless men's community we have on Facebook, that is, you nailed it, Ali, that is absolutely emasculating for those guys that have some sort of issue and just cannot physically have children, and it kills them, and literally at times for some, and because of the way that we are, we don't know how to handle it. It's more it so we as I'll talk. I like to think that the generations now will be different, but as a Gen X man, I can tell you that I'm lonely inside my own head, even though I'm with a wonderful partner. And so when you think about these guys who've now become emasculated, it's an even deeper loneliness, and they've got it's really sad, to be quite honest. But yeah, it is very much so.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think that's so hard, isn't it? I know my husband doesn't identify as childless. He's quite nuanced about it all. And I think the reason we haven't had children is because of my body. But I think had it been the other way around, I think that would have been really hard for his identity and who he is and how he shows up. But as it happens now, he's kind of like, well, I'm not childless. Yeah, I would have had kids. It would have been like a nice thing, a nice to have, not a need to have. And I think there's that nuance again of that binary, isn't there, in terms of, well, he's not child-free, he's not childless, he's something in the middle. And I think it makes it really difficult to sort of scoop up all those people that don't quite know where they sit.
I think my husband's the same in the way that he was always quite okay with not having children, then met me, and about 4 or 5 years after his ex-partner did have children. And it was kind of like children would always been the icing on the cake, I suppose, or the cherry on top, I suppose, as opposed to being the deal breaker. There's still a cake, it's still there, it's still okay. But we've had that conversation where, the really tricky one of like, oh, go meet someone else and have kids. You don't have to stay with me. The responsibility actually is sort of slightly twofold, but mostly lies with me, medically so. But yeah, it's been a really tricky one. And it's been hard for him to sort of like work out where he sits with that. I'd say sometimes he's sort of like, yeah, I'm child free because this is the choice I've been given. If I wanted kids, the choice would have to be I have to go and find somebody else. I either have to go and cheat on you or leave you, and that's kind of the choice. So therefore, I have chosen not to have children because that's it, as opposed to feeling perhaps that he's a childless man. It's a complicated thing, I think, for him, that emotional kind of where you sit. There's an empathy, and I think, and the kindness with both. And I think that's kind of how I see it, really. I going back, circling right back to the very beginning again of the episode and the recording about friendships and allyships. And certainly I've found that my child-free friends have been amazing. And I have the extraordinary position of where my brother has chosen not to have children. So that is both grief for my parents, I think. I talked about it before and it came up a bit at Storyhouse last year. It's very difficult to talk about that for me. I can't really articulate it so well, but it's again, it's a safe space. I'm never going to be an aunt, which is a cause of grief for me. But also I don't have that issue of imbalance, I suppose, as well, that I've seen from so many people who are childless not by choice, that there's a sibling that's gone on to have lots of children, or a child, and it alters the family structure enormously. I have that distance through cousins instead, and that's sometimes nice, but also there's a grief there as well. I don't have an association to that conversation. I can't deal with that. And Dawn, you're nodding because I know that's something that when we sat with your wonderful parents, we can't not talk about how wonderful your parents were at Storyhouse and how that just moved everyone to tears, and how much empathy and kindness there was, and parallels, I think, with a lot of people who were childless. There was a lot of love there, I think, for all of them.
I think, just listening to the kind of conversation there about partners and their position, I think what's drawn out of that, and what I can't help but thinking, is how nuanced and how murky and how even all is, and how a lot of the time partners have had to make choices. Like my husband chose me over the possibility of having children. And I also just, something I've not necessarily made clear here, but just, I think Dawn made it quite clear actually when she said, every day it's not just one decision to not have children and then that's it. It's I've the reason I'm so vocal about it, and I've written about it, I don't need to dwell on it, is I had a really awful experience with an ex-mother-in-law who begged me to have children, and it really had me questioning my psyche, my identity. It caused great issues. So I've reassessed and revisited and looked into it. I've read, I've researched. And although I'm secure in my decision not to have children, there's many parts of having children I crave, I want. There's aspects that I see the romantic side of it, the kind of bedtime stories, and I love taking a couple of my friends' kids to, I don't know, we went to the Scottish Deer Park a few weeks ago, and I really enjoy that. I also, can I say, I enjoy giving them back and going home, but there's parts I really enjoy, and there's parts like I find Christmas very difficult for my own family estrangements reasons, but also I recognize I do have a loss there, and although I've chosen it, and this is where it's murky, I can understand that might prickle some of you, so I'm sorry if that does, because I have chosen it and I'll own that. But there's times when I do feel a sadness of the weight of my choice. Like I don't want it enough to go down that route, but it doesn't mean I can't have little moments of sadness or snippets of grief if I don't have it. And I know that might land in a complicated way.
We're going to bring in the audience questions now because the chat's been quite furious. Thank you both for the conversation. Furious and busy is what I mean. Cross that word out. Busy. There we are. And we've been chatting so much, and we could go on for ages, but I'm aware that we've got about another 10 minutes or so before the end. So let's have a quick look through. We've got comments. My impression is that most people who have children think that people who don't have children don't have them due to A, choice, B, infertility, and can't get their heads around the childless by circumstance category. Yes, I would agree with that. I don't know if there's any comments we want to make on that.
It's about that script again, isn't it? There's one expected life story, and divergence from that can just blow people's minds for whatever reason. So I think that's a really lovely way of encapsulating that. Again, I don't want to sort of pit parents and non-parents, against each other, but there isn't very much space for people who have made that choice or who have had children to sort of to talk about regret or to say, actually, this wasn't right for me. And that must be really difficult to hear for people who are, for childless communities, that might be a point that parents get to. But you can't have buyer's remorse, can you? You can't take them back, and there's no receipt. So pronatalism does that too. Pronatalism doesn't leave space to challenge parenting in any way that can be really, really problematic and really painful and really damaging.
The other interesting one here, I love this. Even International Women's Day is mainly about mothers. Oh yeah, and actually, can I just say International Men's Day, as we found out last year, was mostly about fathers. And in fact, International Men's Day, if you listen, I'm going to tag you, frankly, in this as well, is that your graphic is of a what I assume to be a father and daughter, and actually that is so biased and pronatalist. But yes, it is. I agree with that too. It excludes a lot of women and men.
Yeah, yeah. At Chester though this year, because of the work that Storyhouse Childless have done, they invited Robert back for International Robert's Day, International Men's Day. So, did I say International Robert's Day? Maybe there should be an International Robert's Day, International Men's Day, to sort of talk about childlessness, which I thought was, obviously an excellent move, but interesting how these conversations can be contagious and open up space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that International Robert's Day. Yeah, he'd quite like that, I think.
I think we've got one more, and then we'll have to wrap up. I think, and it says that do Dawn and Ali worry about aging without children?
That is a brilliant question, and thank you. Do you know what's really interesting? I think I covered this. Sorry, Don, I've not even given you a chance to breathe. I just went boom. I actually said this, I think, at the Storyhouse, and I was quite nervous raising it because I don't worry yet, but I feel it's going to come there. My husband does. My husband worries about it, and it's starting to prickle at me. But I feel, as a child-free person, I don't know how to talk about it because I feel I will be met with people saying, "But you made this choice. This is on you." And this is an area that I feel I don't know how to circumnavigate. So we all know that having children is not is not. There's no guarantees that someone's going to be looking after you and advocating for you in later years. I mean, that's kind of nonsense, and it's not a reason to have children. But it's such a relevant question. So, and I'm still, my answer is I'm still looking for my voice on this topic. I feel there's a lot of things like I recently wrote a piece about how adult-only spaces are not an attack on children. And I actually wonder if that kind of dialogue is something that childless people feel they can't talk about because you might, I don't know whether you'd think you're being perceived as resentful or bitter, but I feel I can have a voice on that kind of thing, even though people think it comes across as hateful to children, which is not the point. But I don't feel I can have a voice, or I'm trying to find my voice on the topic of aging without children. So yes, it is a factor. And thank you for asking it.
Yeah, I think I'm probably in a similar position to where Ali is. Again, it's to do with, maturation, isn't it? And thinking about life stages and all of that sort of stuff for us. We often joke that it'll be our nieces and nephews that are looking after us, but again that relies on particular, Berenice, it's your point, it relies on a very particular biological notion of kinship that actually it's fictitious and doesn't help at all and can hinder. So if we're thinking about those, I mean, but yeah, I often say to our nieces and nephews, you better be nice to me because when I'm old, and if we're thinking about what happens later, I might have to rely on you, and that is a joke, but it's because I don't have an answer for it. I think we're not sure. Humor often sort of can fill the gap, can't it, with these things, but also point to more complicated experiences. And yeah, I think I'm more aware of thinking about it because of things like Childless, Storyhouse. It helps to be aware and it helps to plan. And we do have taboos. We have taboos on aging. We have taboos on dying. We're not very good socially thinking about, in the West anyway, thinking about those sorts of questions. So I think that the conversations we've been having at Storyhouse Childless about that have just raised my awareness a little bit. But certainly now that my parents, who you've all seen and met, are getting a bit older, I'm sort of thinking, okay, well, if that's happening to them and what is going to be my responsibility, then there's the gap, isn't there? And that's one of the strong stories, I think, that came out of that of Storyhouse Childless when we've talked about it. It's a great question, thanks.
That's really good. There's an awful lot of love in there as well for the conversation today. And someone said that your parents helped them so much as well, Dawn. So thank you very much.
I'll pass that on. They still say, my mum in particular, says it's one of the greatest things she's ever done. And
Oh,
that was,
fantastic.
yeah, and that was, but because of the people that she met. It wasn't about her being up there. It was, the conversations that she had, afterwards, and and during it. And she's now become a really powerful advocate. So whenever there's a pronatalist conversation, at the golf club or something, she's like, not everyone can have children, you shouldn't assume that. She's she's
I love that.
yeah. And she'll say, no, you can't assume I'm a grandmother, all that I ever will be, and that's my daughter's choice. But for some people, that's a really difficult point, and you shouldn't assume it.
There you go, allyship in action,
I
right
know.
there. That's it.
She tells me this every time. Well, guess what someone said today?
Oh, that's I love that so much.
That's one of the best endings for any podcast it ever had. I think that's it. If not the start.
So thank you so much for coming along and being so open to all the questions and the viewpoints. It's been, I could listen to you all day actually talking about it. I think it's a really fascinating topic. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks to you for, for everything that you do. Allyship goes both ways. Solidarity and friendship go both ways. And I always learn so much from listening to stories and from sharing these experiences. And your generosity and warmth was such a valuable part of Storyhouse Childless. I'm sorry for those people who can't come to Storyhouse Childless. Hopefully one day you will. But that's thank you for inviting us.
Thanks for listening. We hope you found our conversation with Dawn and Ali as powerful and impactful as we did. We'd love to hear from you if you found this topic interesting or have been able to sit with the child-free experience in this episode. If you'd like to find out more about our podcast, or you have a great idea for a topic we've not yet covered, or you just want to know a bit more about, we'd love to hear from you. We want this podcast to have as many voices from across our community and outside it as possible. So if something's missing or you just want a deeper dive on it, just let us know. You can find us on Facebook, Insta, Twitter and LinkedIn. You can also become a member of our new online community, which is a safe and inclusive space for anyone that's a member of the Childless community. More details are available on our website at www.thefullstoppod.com. You can sign up to our listeners list at the website, which keeps you up to date on what we're up to, and if you'd like to, you can also donate to our work. As always, it's important for us to remind you, you're not alone.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Ali, do you notice that's sort of like inviting us? Like we're two on behalf of my partner and I.
Yes, can I say it's an honour to be spoken for by Dawn? It's an honour.
It's good.